Good morning, everybody, and hello and welcome to the first in a new economic discussion series from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on shaping the recovery from the coronavirus pandemic in a way that reduces poverty. My name is Richard Partington. I'm an economics correspondent from the Guardian newspaper, and I'm joined today by Dave Innes, who leads the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's economics team, who will be presenting us the findings of a new report that will be published tomorrow. So you're getting a bit of a sneak peek there. The report will be arguing for levelling up to tackle two twin challenges, namely the productivity challenge for the UK, and secondly, the living standards challenge, both of which are vital for reducing poverty in this country. We're also joined today by Tera, Allas, who's Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey's UK and Ireland office. She works closely with the McKinsey Global Institute and leads the consultancy's work on productivity, technology adoption and government effectiveness. We're also joined today on the panel by Andrew Carter, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities. It's one of Britain's leading think tanks focused on improving economies of cities and large towns. He's been leading the organisation now with 25 years of experience working on urban economic and policy issues. I think we all know that levelling up has been a phrase that has entered public debate ahead of last year's election, but it means a great deal to many people. I think one thing that we'll look at today will be exactly what it does mean. I think there is a bit of debate about what it is there, but it's such a vital moment for this report to be published, given that we're going through the worst crisis in living memory, and that tackling it will most certainly require a levelling up of the economy to make sure that all people experience a strong recovery from this difficult moment. Before we start, I want to go through a couple of quick housekeeping rules. All attendees' microphones and videos will remain off throughout the webinar. The event is being recorded, and attendees will be sent a link to the recording, slides and further information about the economic discussion series, which we are launching today. We have more than 340 attendees online, including some journalists. There's really a fantastic number of people that are interested in this event. I think it really shows the importance of it at this moment, as I say. All attendees will be able to receive a copy of the report if you've not already done so. And we're going to hear for about an hour in total. First of all, from Dave, who will present his findings of the report, including slides that you should be able to see here on Zoom. Our expert panellists will then respond to the presentation and put forward their own ideas for levelling up to unlock people currently trapped in poverty. That will leave us about a half hour for a good question and answer session where the panel will take all of your questions. Should you wish to submit a question, you will be asked to do so via the Q&A function on Zoom. You can ask questions at any time during the session, but they will only be answered during the Q&A portion. A moderator will be looking at those and put forward those questions to me, and I will put them to the panel. We'll try and get through as many questions as possible. Just to note that the chat function has been disabled today for attendees due to the large number of people joining us, so please do use the Q&A channel in order to ask questions. I don't want to say too much more before I hand over to Dave, but I will say that I think this report is really key at a moment, as I say, where we're exiting the crisis phase of the coronavirus outbreak and starting to emerge into a new normal world, one in which the levelling up agenda certainly should play no less a role than it did before. And we did think that this crisis at first may be very brief. There was hope of a V-shaped recovery that would be quite rapid in its form. However, the Bank of England now estimates the collapse in GDP this year could be the largest in more than 3 centuries, and we're quite clearly at the foothills of a very damaging recession. But in economics, it isn't just about whether GDP goes up or down. This crisis will have a significant impact on people's lives, particularly for those in poverty. The future of the businesses and the prosperity and cohesion of communities is vital to tackle during this period. And we have got a control over this. It's not as though we can just stand idly by. We can shape the response to the recovery, and it's why today's contributions from Joseph Rowntree and the panel will be pivotal, and I hope shaping the response to this pandemic. We've all seen how local authorities in particular are facing financial black hole caused by this crisis. and therefore, as we focus on levelling up, they will play a key role in responding to this problem. Before now, there were significant problems for the economy, as the levelling up agenda had shown. We had, according to Joseph Rowntree, 14.5 million people trapped in poverty going into the crisis. Those issues are only going to be exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. We know that people across the country felt cut off from the prosperity of other areas before this crash, and that the last crisis back in 2008, it took a full 12 years for average wages to recover back to their pre-crisis levels after accounting for inflation. On the road to recovery, there are going to be major challenges. We have Brexit by the end of this year, technological automation, the challenges to tackle inequality. COVID could make these much harder. Public finances have been battered by this crisis. The government is raising spending to cushion the blow, but there is talk at the moment of whether that will now be reduced in future, given the scale of the debt that Britain is taking on. We know that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are currently preparing to deliver speeches over the next couple of weeks to set out how they plan to reopen the economy from more than 3 months of lockdown, which has brought life as we know it to a complete standstill. As we exit this crisis phase, the report today and Joseph Rowntree's discussion series, as which I mentioned is launching today, will be really important for helping to shape this response. We all have a role to play in shaping it, but I'd like to hand over first of all to Dave to outline Joseph Rowntree's report today on the Levelling Up Challenge. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Richard. Now, just while my slides are loading up, which hopefully you can see in front of you very shortly, I'd like to ask you to cast your minds back to the 11th of March, which is a few months ago, but feels like much longer ago, when the new energetic Chancellor was standing up in the House of Commons to deliver his first budget. And we were at the foothills of the COVID-19 outbreak, but the Chancellor wanted to be clear, this was still his levelling up budget. And so his ambitious spending commitments followed, £600 billion over 5 years for roads, railways, broadbands and homes. And the size of these commitments really represents that levelling up our regionally unbalanced economy had become the biggest political challenge that our society faced. It's safe to say we're in a different world now. But as we come out of the first stage of the health crisis and begin to see the economic impacts of COVID-19, levelling up our economy will still be the greatest national challenge that we face. And as Richard said, for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we think levelling up means tackling two related geographical challenges. First are the differences in economic performance across our country that mean that many people and places feel cut off from high productivity jobs that exist in some areas. This map shows average productivity of local authorities across the country, places with above average productivity in blue, places with below average productivity in red. And as we say, high productivity places are concentrated in London and the southeast, whereas many rural places, many of our towns and cities across the Midlands and the north have below average productivity. And second are differences in living standards across the country, which mean that many people feel cut off from the prosperity that other people feel. And at JRF, we particularly care about the number of people trapped in poverty. So this map shows the child poverty rate across the country, measured before housing costs. And we look at the child poverty rate because we've got better data on it than the adult poverty rate. And what we see is some similarities with the first picture. So child poverty tends to be lower in the southeast, but there are also some differences. So it's notable that many more rural local authorities see both low productivity and low child poverty rates, but also child poverty is concentrated in our towns and cities across the Midlands and the North in particular. And one thing we know at the national level, we know that productivity is the biggest driver of living standards over time. When we look at the local level, that relationship is there. There is a relationship between productivity and the child poverty rate, but it's a fairly weak one. And what this shows when we're thinking about these two challenges is that if we need to address both of them, we have to address both of them. We can't rely on tackling productivity and assuming that will automatically solve our living standards problem. Now, before going on to talking about how we solve those two incredibly important problems, I want to pause for a second to think about what has changed in the last few months. And there are two particularly big changes. First, the public finances. So in March, we had a government emerging from 10 years of fiscal consolidation, emboldened to spend again. We've now seen debt rise to more than 100% of GDP. It's reasonable in those circumstances to wonder, can we still afford that £600 billion that we were promised? But actually in the report, we argue that we can't afford not to level up the economy. One lesson from the last 10 years is that it's very difficult to pay down the debt without productivity growth. In the long run, paying down debt is much easier with a fast-growing economy. And with the government able to borrow at historically low interest rates at the moment, we can afford to take a long view about how we pay down the debt. And as levelling up is essential to restoring productivity growth, the spending required to level up the economy will, in the long run, be good for the public purse. Now, just to kind of demonstrate these points, this chart provides an illustrative example using the most recent OBR forecasts for the long-term projection for debt to GDP, which might be a bit more optimistic than we'd look at now, but they're the most recent ones we had. And then compare that to a scenario where in the short term, we spend a bit more on capital investment, but that boosts growth over the long run. And that just demonstrates the point that over the long term, policies that increase the rate of growth now, improving productivity, is key to dealing with that high debt. Second are the geographical impacts of COVID-19. And this chart shows that the places that went into COVID-19 with the highest unemployment rates have also seen unemployment increase the fastest in the last 3 months. And we know that many high earners across the country have built up savings while they've been working from home but cut down on spending, whereas low earners are much more likely to have been unemployed or furloughed and go into debt to meet up with, to manage to keep up with the costs that they face. And this has geographical impacts as well. So richer places might come out of this with consumers with pent-up savings ready to spend again, which could foster a recovery. In left behind places, the recovery is much more likely to take longer to arrive. So we really think that the government needs to take action now to stop the levelling up challenge becoming harder in the next few months and years. And they could do this through a number of ways. It's really important that we target job creation schemes on places that have seen the biggest increase in unemployment rates, where people who are unemployed are facing the biggest challenge in finding local vacancies. Government should provide extended business support to areas where recovery returns slowest. And I think we should also think about how fiscal policies, whether we can provide extra local stimulus to help places recover quicker than they otherwise would. But that's the short term. So how best, looking further ahead, to tackle these deep-seated productivity and living standard problems that we have? Looking back to that March 11 budget, we contained a big focus on investment, and in particular, increasing and rebalancing transport investment and research and development. We've also in the last few months had a lot of focus on green jobs and the role that encouraging new kinds of jobs could play in the recovery. All of that focus is sensible policy and could bring high productivity jobs into regions of the country where those jobs are currently too far and few and far between. And they would fix part of the UK's productivity imbalances that we have at the moment. But we think this is just the start of an agenda that would truly level up productivity and living standards across the country. And so I wanted to highlight 3 areas that we think should play a much bigger role in the levelling up agenda to do so. The first is skills. And when we look in the report at what local economic conditions affect the child poverty rate, as well as productivity and wages, it's skills that has the biggest impact. And in particular, the proportion of the population locally with 5 GCSEs or equivalent. And skills are really important to help people progress out of low paid, low productivity work. But they also shape the local economy. They have productivity impacts as well. So recent evidence shows that a failure to invest in skills has actually contributed to what's known as the hollowing out of the labour market in the UK. So a growth of low skilled as well as high skilled jobs, but a fall in middle skilled jobs. And other countries with different skills policies that have invested differently in skills have actually seen something called skills upgrading instead. So growth of middle skilled jobs and fall of low skilled jobs. Now, the March budget did contain this commitment to a new national skills fund, but at about £600 million a year, it was just 0.5% of the size of the capital investment planned. That should change. Skills should become a much bigger role in the levelling up agenda. And to do that, we think the government should feel a lot less bound by the distinction between capital and current investment that's currently in place in the fiscal rules. If we look at the long term, any spending that boosts our growth and productivity prospects is prudent spending, and we should prioritise it now. The second area is local transport. Our previous research has highlighted how a lack of decent public transport options can leave people disconnected from local labour markets, even when they live close by. And lacking public transport also holds back our productivity. So many of our cities, companies and businesses in our cities are held back from being as productive as they can be because they can't access the greater pool of labour in their local area that they should be able to. So looking back at the budget again, there was again this commitment to a new local transport fund, but it was only about 50% bigger than the amount committed to potholes. This is another area where it should just play a much bigger role in our levelling up agenda. And the third area I wanted to focus on is low wage, low productivity jobs, of which we've got too many across our country. Many others have highlighted the long tail of low productivity businesses that we have in the UK. And regionally, we see that we have that long tail in every region, but it tends to be longer and lower productivity in our lagging regions. And many of these jobs are in sectors such as retail, leisure, hospitality, which tend to employ a large share of the people that we know that are trapped in in-work poverty. And it's easy to overlook these sectors when we're thinking about how best to improve productivity. But our previous research comparing our companies in those sectors with many of the countries we like to think of as our competitors, the US, France, and Germany, shows that they outperform us in those areas as well. And there are lots of productivity gains to be made in those sectors if we look for them. So in particular, by a focus on increasing management standards, increasing access to in-work training, and also by increasing job quality itself. So here are 4 recommendations for how we can truly level up. First, we need to focus on job creation and maintaining spending power in our weakest economies to stop the levelling up challenge from becoming even harder in the next few months. Second, we need to increase the scale of investment in basic digital and vocational skills to match the ambitious commitments to investment we've already seen for capital spending. Third, we need to increase the share of that capital investment that we've been promised that goes into our local public transport systems, and we need to lever this infrastructure investment to unlock opportunities for people currently trapped in poverty. And fourth, we need to improve the productivity of jobs in our low wage sectors so that we have fewer low wage, low productivity jobs in future. Now, before I finish, there's a political challenge to this as well. And alongside the report on how to level up we've got tomorrow, we're also publishing a report showing the growing role that low-income voters have played in recent elections, and that trend has continued to the last one, December 2019. And when we come to the next election, these low-income voters will be judging the main parties on which they think will be most likely to deliver on their levelling up promises. Now, these are just our ideas. As Richard says, we're really keen to get a discussion going here. So I really look forward to the ideas of the other panellists. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dave, for that presentation. Really interesting stuff. I'm going to move on now to Tera Allas from McKinsey, who's going to respond to Dave's thoughts and outline some of her own on the levelling up challenge as she sees it. She's a productivity expert, so I'm fascinated to hear what she's got to say. So over to you, Tera. It'd be good to hear from you.
Thank you for involving me in this fascinating discussion today. Dave has done a wonderful job of actually diagnosing what the issues are and proposing some critical ways forward, which I would have to say I agree with all of them. What I wanted to do was take a slightly deeper look at what do we mean by leveling up, and then draw some similar conclusions to Dave's, but with a slightly different nuance. So I'm going to start screen sharing in a minute. Hopefully you will see this on your screens now. It's a bit of a complicated chart, so bear with me, but I wanted to tell a little story about the data regarding to local authorities, and I picked local authorities as a particular sort of geography just because there's a lot of data about it, and really if we're thinking about leveling up, that's probably a decent granularity of geography to focus on. I'm just double checking that you guys can see the thing on your screen. Yes, I see nods, so that's good news. Right, so let me tell you a bit of a story about what we find in the data. So if we start in the top right-hand box here, what we've got on the x-axis is the number of pupils that are in inadequate or improvement needed schools, and on the y-axis we find the the average education level of people in any particular local authority. And unsurprisingly, you find that there's a correlation. So the worse your local schools, the fewer people go on to higher or further education. And therefore, schools have a direct impact, at least a correlation with your levels of education. And then if we move down the grid and we put the average education level on the x-axis and we compare it to what is going on with incomes, then again, not surprising that the higher educated a place is on average, the higher the incomes in that area. If we do the same trick and we again put the incomes on the x-axis and on the y-axis look at health, in this particular case, we've looked at it on the basis of the presence of physical illness. You can see that the places where there are more educated people are much more healthy on average as well. And by the way, there's a bit of an urban-rural split as well. The red bubbles are more urban areas and the green bubbles are more rural areas. But then, not everything is positive about income. So when we compare now on the y-axis, the net household incomes to Gini as a measure of inequality, actually the areas which have the highest incomes also have the highest inequality. And this is starting to suggest that maybe this lens of looking at things purely through a local lens might not always be appropriate. And similarly, if we compare all of these things to well-being, then the higher the income inequality in a particular place, the lower its average self-reported well-being is. So there does seem to be a reason for people to be unhappy in these places, partly because of their incomes. Many of their incomes are lower than the average income or the high incomes, and so that inequality creates issues for the people on the lower income spectrum. And in fact, remarkably, we also find that people in areas which are healthier are less happy. In other words, the higher the level of incidence of illness, the lower the level of well-being, which kind of doesn't make any sense given that health is one of the biggest drivers of well-being at an individual level. So there must be other things going on. And so finally, if we just compare back to looking at incomes and well-being, there's basically either a negative or practically no correlation here. So it's all of a bit of a complicated story. That's my message number one. It is very, very complex. And therefore, no one size fits all solutions are likely to work here. The second point is that the local lens may not be the right lens for everything. So for example, on well-being and some of the aspects of inequality are more likely to be even more granular than local authorities. And so we need different layers of policy to deal with different aspects of what ultimately is important in people's lives. The final point I would come back to, which sort of echoes what Dave said, is that, you know, there are many reasons why these correlations exist, and some of them are really, really hard to break. So if you have a dynamic local economy that attracts a lot of talent, attracts a lot of businesses, attracts investment, then it's very hard for someone to kind of catch up with them, which doesn't have those same qualities. But the one area that we should be able to break that kind of virtuous or vicious cycle with is around schooling. I see no reason why we should have worse schools in areas that are less prosperous. It is a redistribution question, of course, but it is one area where we can break that sort of virtuous, well, vicious cycles for some of the places that are being left behind. So hopefully that's an interesting overview of what some of the challenges are. And I think the responses would very much be around not just investing in the physical capital, but very much investing in the human capital that ultimately makes these places either thrive or less thriving. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tera. That's fantastic, and some exciting and interesting charts there. Very, very good. I'm going to move on to Andrew Carter now from the Centre for Cities think tank to hear his thoughts on levelling up as a challenge and how best for town, city, and also national leaders to respond.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. So, like Tera, I mean, I agree and endorse all of what Dave said. A big fan of his work, always have been. I think the three aspects, and just worth emphasising from Dave, you know, this relationship between growth and poverty, we need to think about that very carefully. And we have to be proactive on both, in a sense that, you know, the idea that focusing only on one necessarily deals with the other is, I think, unproven and unfounded in the evidence. So I think that's an important point. We need to be proactive on both fronts. The other thing I would completely and utterly endorse is his focus and emphasis on skills and education. And if you think, you know, if we spent nearly all of the levelling up money on skills and education, I'd be quite happy about that. Certainly much more than is currently being put forward. And then the final part, which I would definitely agree with Dave on in particular, is the reminder of the politics and the political element to this. There is a political reason why the government should take levelling up very seriously if it wants to win a next election. And I think we should never lose sight of the politics and how that encourages politicians to make decisions that they might not ordinarily make. So I agree with everything that Dave has said. So in terms of the discussion, let me just give three very quick thoughts on bits I suppose I would give a slightly bit more emphasis to. So Dave's got them in there. He's talked about them. I would just sort of turn up the degree of emphasis. So the first one I would add more weight and emphasis to, and we need to think about this, is actually just the quality of and the importance of institutions. In a sense, we talk about policy and initiatives, and often, particularly in this country, we very rarely or seriously talk about, you know, the importance of institutions to longer-term economic performance. And the evidence is increasingly clear on this. Institution and the quality of institutions is a real important factor for long-term prosperity, or however you define it, not just for individuals, but for places. But we know, we've already heard, that at the subnational level, at the local level, our institutions are underfunded. Local government, you know, saw massive cuts, 10 years of austerity. You saw that. We've done the analysis. Others have done it. Local government singled out for quite serious and significant constraints even before we got to COVID. So that's a different conversation. And massively underpowered, in a sense of their powers and responsibilities and capabilities. Pretty much compared to every other OECD country, our local institutions are underempowered and underfunded. And if we are serious about levelling up, then we need to think about how we build the capacity of institutions, almost irrespective of what they end up doing. We just need more robust institutions. We need to do much more around that. So that would be my first point. My second point would be, I would give a slightly greater emphasis. Again, Dave did this, but I would sort of turn up a little bit more the thinking around the growth and innovation aspects of the levelling up agenda. And particularly because we know the skewed geography of growth and innovation, which is heavily weighted into the greater southeast. What's interesting when you look into the north and in the Midlands, it's the absence of these sorts of firms or the absence of these sorts of assets. It's not that they're there, it's actually that they're not there. And I think we need to be very mindful about how we actually create demand in the economy. That leads me to think much more about, and again, Dave touched on it, innovation investment, R&D investment, exporting support. Can we get firms that are trading locally to be trading outside of their localities, tax credits for investment, and the overall place conditions that we know are more or less conducive for innovation-led firms, high-value firms. So again, I would just dial that up because I think, in the absence of the demand part of the economy, then the supply side is always going to be limited in what it can actually achieve. And then my final and third point, very briefly, would be, again, I would give slightly more emphasis of, at least we need to be more cognizant of the geography of the economy as it is. And as we've seen already, most of the economy happens in our cities and large towns. Part of the problem is as you move up the country through the Midlands and the North, more of our cities and our large towns underperform. So when you think about a levelling up agenda for the North and the Midlands, it's impossible to do that, I would argue, unless Greater Manchester or Leeds and Liverpool and Sheffield, which are all underperforming relative to the national average, if they're not stronger engines of growth and prosperity, it's very difficult to see how that plays out at the kind of regional or super regional level. So thinking about, the geography and then how do we make the most of that rather than wish it to be something else would be the kind of third final element that I would just dial up the emphasis on. But as I said, these are additions to to what Dave and the JRF have been talking about, not things that they are, as I know, are not grappling with. So those would be my just kind of three quick fire responses.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Some fascinating thoughts once again there. So thank you so much for your presentation at the beginning there, Dave and Tera and Andrew, for your responses. We're going to move on to the Q&A section of this webinar. We've got about half an hour still to go, so plenty of time to get through a lot of your questions. We'll try and get through as many as possible. And please do use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit your questions. I think we may have had a couple coming in already, but I'm going to start off and abuse the chair's privilege to begin with a question. We were very interested ahead of the Chancellor reportedly giving a summer statement at the beginning of July. The idea being that he and Boris Johnson will announce measures to stimulate the economy as we exit the crisis phase of the coronavirus pandemic and as lockdown conditions are started to be lifted. Now, if the government is serious about levelling up, as we would hope that they are from this debate, what are the types of things that you would like to see from this summer statement to show that that levelling up agenda has not been abandoned at this critical phase, as you have identified? Perhaps start with Dave, and then the other panellists as well. Be good to hear your thoughts and get a discussion going. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So if I emphasize 2 points that probably already touched on here, but I think first is something that I think hasn't been considered well enough in the last few months, and we would really look for the government to recognise, which is the different geographical impacts of the economic fallout from COVID-19 and the likely shape of the recovery. And really, I think we'd be looking for the government to put something in place that, as I say, stops that challenge getting harder in the next few months or so. So what that looks like, I think there are a few different options, but I think there is, so we've heard kind of rumour that the next stage of policy needs to include some form of job creation programme, whether that's a kind of jobs guarantee or a new kind of future jobs fund that we saw 10 years ago. I think we really need to think about how that affects different places and how we generate jobs in the places that most need them. And we've seen some research by the Institute for Employment Studies recently that JRF's been part of, showing that in some bits of the country, people are facing, if you become unemployed, you're facing 50 other unemployed people for each job. You're facing really, really incredibly tough challenges in getting back into work right now. And it's those sorts of places we really need to see focus for things like job creation. And I think there probably is something more kind of ambitious the government could think of in terms of fiscal policy and how we direct that to see some places stop, to prevent some places seeing a much longer slump than others. So I think some kind of commitment on preventing those short-term impacts, and then longer term recognizing that the March budget, as we say, was a good first step to getting the levelling up agenda in place, but now upping the commitment on skills and transport and the other areas that we've emphasised in the report.
Shall I build on that a little bit? I think that's absolutely right. One of my wishes for any budget in any near-term future is that it actually tries to combine the challenges of, on one hand, supporting people's livelihoods, as many are still struggling, but also starts to kind of pivot us towards the future, and it starts to build the skills and the infrastructure and the sorts of things that we need for the future. If we're going to continue to spend a lot of money on this, then let's spend it in areas that also build those kinds of assets for the future. And so one particular area that would be, I think, very interesting to look into is whether any job creation scheme can actually be linked to building skills and training, and possibly even improving schools and education. One of the observations I've had from various seminars that I've been part of is a lot of people, when they think about building up back better, they sort of focus on the infrastructure, the hard things, and in particular, they make the very relevant point is all of that needs to be consistent with a zero carbon future, which I would agree with. But then that kind of building creates jobs for men. And we know that there are a lot of women, especially single parents, who've been very hard hit by job losses and furloughs as part of the COVID epidemic. So we need to think about kind of all kinds of dimensions here. And my view is that if there is to be a job creation scheme of some sorts and subsidies, that needs to be explicitly linked to some kind of training and skill building, because it is the not very well educated people in this country who also do not get any training from their employer. On average, the lowest socioeconomic group people have had zero training since they left school, and that's just unacceptable in a modern economy, in my view. Of course, there are then going to be people who don't have an employer, and for those, I think the job centers or some other mechanism that allows them to actually use this time and the shift in the shape of the labor market to find skills and jobs that are there in the future as well, rather than just today, I think would be enormously important, and actually would be just a really, really good use of government's money. So on one hand, supporting people who need support, but on the other hand, building back better, but very much in a human capital sense.
I don't think I have really much to add to that, Richard. Both Dave and Tera's answers are pretty complete. So, to avoid duplication, I agree with everything that's just been said.
Excellent. Short and sweet as we like it there. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Dave and Tera. I'm going to move on to some questions from the audience now. We've got some fantastic questions coming in. So I'm going to begin with one from Robert Davies, which is an analytical question about where we find ourselves now after sort of 3 months of the coronavirus pandemic and the challenge that we faced for poverty in this country. I mean, have any of the main drivers on creating poverty before COVID changed in 6 months so far? Are we expected to see a change in those drivers of poverty as we begin to exit this crisis phase?
So if I take that on, so when we look at poverty, we look at the total income someone has coming in, and we normally look at the after housing cost measure. So we subtract the costs and look at whether what they've got left is enough to afford what people need and to participate in society. So I think that so the main thing that has changed, and the key story for us in the last few years ahead of COVID-19 was the rise of in-work poverty. And this mattered a lot to us because we'd seen the economy performing well in lots of ways, so with record employment rates, but 1 in 8 people in work falling into poverty, and those incomes weren't giving people enough to get out of poverty. And at the same time, as we've already discussed, have the big geographical differences in your chance of being trapped in poverty depending on where you live. I mean, the big change is that now we're looking at a big rise in out of work poverty and look at how to get people back into work quickly. I think the key point to emphasize there is that it's important we don't think that the solution has to be just get people back into any work as quickly as possible, but now is the time to be thinking about what were those deeper causes that meant our society was not in a good enough place going into COVID-19, and despite the economic successes had not reduced poverty as well as it should do. And that's why we need to think now about fixing those root causes and properly levelling up as we set out in this report.
I think there's a follow-on to that here from on a similar sort of vein from Tracy Gore, who's she's based in Merseyside, and the tourism, leisure and hospitality sector has seen as a growth area in that part of the world, part close to my home where I went to university, and from nearby. She asks, how do we ensure that we're growing our productivity and increase from low wage, high turnover of staff? So as we are expecting a high rate of unemployment coming out of this crisis, how do we encourage a jobs-rich recovery that is also high productivity?
Shall I say a couple of things just based on my experience on looking specifically at the kind of distribution of productivity across different businesses? And I'm involved in the charity called Be the Business, which is very much trying to help businesses improve their productivity while also creating those jobs. And I think there are probably 2 or 3 kind of very practical things that businesses can do. And then, you know, the government needs to create an environment in which those things are sensible to do. The first one is, of course, a lot of people are now looking for top line growth. In other words, rather than, you know, reducing the amount of labor going into every unit of output, they're saying, well, we've got the people we've got. How do we actually sell more product or services? How do we create an experience for customers that's even more valuable? And therefore we can grow our revenues while not necessarily getting rid of people. So that would be one key aspect. And I think especially in the hospitality sector, there are many, many opportunities through better pricing and better sort of marketing, better customer service to gradually improve those. Of course, it's been incredibly badly hit in this COVID crisis. And so I don't know for sure how we get all of those tourists to keep coming back. Hopefully that relies a little bit more on how we get out of the virus situation, and hopefully there will be some solutions there. The other thing that I would highlight is obviously, you know, I would say this, wouldn't I, but it's the kind of core message of Be the Business. It's around good management and leadership, because that's really, for me, a real unlock. If you have good management and leadership in businesses, first of all, they will look after their people, they will train them, they will make sure that they are in jobs that best fit their skills and their needs. But secondly, you are going to get better teamwork across different aspects of the business. You're going to get better streamlined and lower cost services, and that means you will drive up demand. And so there are many, many reasons why that helps. Now, what's the government intervention that would help better business leadership and management? Well, I think there are many, but one of the critical things is, you know, we should maybe go back to some of the schemes that we had in the past around Growth Accelerator or other things like that, where we're just supporting businesses to nudging them almost to get over the barriers that they inevitably have in their daily lives to that space where they can take a little bit of a step back and say, how do we grow this business so that it benefits both the community, the employees, and the owners, of course.
The only thing I would add on that, I mean, if you're trying to think about the priority of challenges, you know, I'm much more worried about the employment effects and issues associated with those kind of urban services. When, you know, when we look at the growth of many of our cities, particularly from an employment point of view, as we well know, many of them have added lots and lots of jobs in those kind of urban services activities, hospitality, retail, has been significant job generators over the last decade or so, as part of the story about why we've seen some of our cities come back from previous decades of decline, as the economy has shifted much more to a kind of service orientated economy. So the worry, in a sense, this is the bigger question, which we genuinely don't know yet, is the degree to which, from an employment point of view, those kind of industries continue to be, or at least recover from, the short-term effects that we've seen of the pandemic and the ensuing lockdown. I mean, I'm slightly less worried about productivity gains and improvements at the minute. I'm much more worried about, can we do as best as we possibly can to give these sorts of firms the support that they need in order to reopen and to recover. And that will be about what's going on inside the firm. But as we've seen in lots of different places, that actually includes things like being much more flexible about land use and allowing retail and restaurants and pubs to use outside space that is currently used for other purposes. That's going to have a significant effect in the short run as to whether firms can get up and running. VAT reductions are not going to do anything in terms of really improving the kind of activities of those. If we really are going into a fiscal conversation, we're going to need to be much more targeted around doing that, and kind of general VAT reductions are not going to benefit those sorts of industries if they literally cannot trade anywhere near where they ideally need to.
It's an interesting and important point, and very topical as we head towards this summer statement. There's a good question here as well. I think it might be for Andrew again, but for the panel as a whole, from Emily Matthew on how do you think that COVID will change the nature of cities being engines of growth? And I had an idea, a point to add to that as well, in that how important will devolution be to the levelling up agenda as we seek to kind of embed that into the recovery? Is that an important part of the recovery from the coronavirus crisis?
Yeah, so let me deal with the second one first. I mean, in a sense, devolution becomes incredibly more important in some respects because of the variations and the nuances we see in different places and the ability to respond. But the second thing is the scale of the response that is going to be needed, the size of it, just in terms of what is going to be required. Look at what's happened to the labour market. We haven't been in this situation since the 1980s. The notion, the idea that central government can do it all is just for the birds. Right? So even if you just from a pragmatic delivery point of view, you're going to need more players doing more things. So devolution is a mechanism and a means by which they can actually get involved into this sort of space and do more. Plus, it links to my point I was making on. It's also an important part about building institutions. What's you see through the pandemic and the way it's been responded to across different countries. Interestingly, local institutions, more robust institutions, have actually been able to respond better in many countries and a more centralized system than we have, ironically, I think, in some respects. Now, that's in some respects, that's a kind of easier answer. The bigger question which you ask is, what's the future of cities? Well, look, I genuinely don't know. And anybody that is categorical on this statement, you should ignore them because they don't know either. But they're just trying to be categorical for argument's kind of sake. But where I am, based on the evidence, my understanding is, I think COVID and the lockdown and what comes of it introduces additional frictions for cities, but it doesn't alter the fundamentals. Right? You see this kind of suddenly a sort of zeitgeist around working from home, which I don't fully understand. Really, in terms of when you look at the data and actually the scale of that, I think it's massively overplayed. And it's typically people on these kind of calls that think that everybody can work from home, which is obviously patently not the case. So I think it creates conditions which are more challenging for us. We'll have to work this out. Public transport is a kind of good example, how we're going to need to think very carefully about how we make mass transit safe and appropriate for places. But I think we can get there, and it will take time to get there, but we can get there. My other point would be, and this definitely fits into Dave's point, let's imagine that our cities do no longer the engines of growth that the questioner asked. I would be deeply worried about that, particularly from a poverty and accessibility, because what we know is if our cities go into decline, it'll be the poorer communities and the poorer households that will demonstrably suffer as a result of that. If jobs are more dispersed, they become less accessible to poorer people. If jobs are working from home rather than, you know, in central locations which are accessible, it's poorer people that cannot work from home that do the job. So, you know, let's not just blindly wander into this conversation that it's all fine if our cities decline. There are poverty implications, never mind productivity implications, if our urban areas really do go into decline.
I just add a couple of points. So I agree with lots of excellent points from Andrew. If I add one point and emphasize another one, which is that, so I completely agree that we just don't know how the forces that drive where economic activity take place are going to change after this, and there's so much uncertainty there now. But one thing I think is the case is that, so if it does change things, if it does kind of change what those economic forces are, there will be some new opportunities as well as other ones. So more kind of wealthy people working from home, maybe there's more job opportunities because they want to spend more money locally. But if those things do arise, it's going to be seen locally. So it's going to be, the knowledge comes from seeing that take place. It's impossible to predict at a national level. And I think that speaks to Andrew's point about needing strong local institutions that can spot those opportunities and take advantage of them with local policies where they are appropriate. So I think it backs up that point. And then secondly, I think is that point on who can and who can't work from home. And it does make you think much more about the kinds of jobs where people don't have access to that. And we've mentioned lots of them already: retail, hospitality, manufacturing jobs, and bigger focus on what connectivity needs to look like for people in those jobs, and also to help them access more jobs. So I think it lends more weight to that, if anything, than otherwise.
Excellent. I think there's a lot of questions coming through on this same sort of subject about, you know, how COVID changes the way that we are currently living our lives at this moment in time, while the virus is still prevalent in the community and there is no vaccine. That we're being discouraged from using public transport, and therefore, you know, this drive to increase productivity and the levelling up agenda through large-scale infrastructure investment, perhaps that needs rethinking. Again, I think this drives back to the point you were talking about with education and skills playing such an important role. Would you want to kind of elaborate on that? How can education and skills be invested in? What are the best mechanisms for that? And there's a question here from Pavel Arjan from Indeed, who asks, what is the best way to determine which skills to invest in? And should this vary by local area?
So I'm happy to start by providing a little bit of insights into the kind of what skills in which areas and for what reason. We've done quite a lot of kind of fairly detailed analysis on occupation by occupation and sort of 50 different categories of knowledge and qualifications and workplace skills, and which of those are going to be most in demand in the future versus which of them have been declining and are likely going to be declining in the future. The caveat that I would say, though, is that I then went and dug out a report from 20 years ago, and the kinds of things that they were saying literally 20 years ago were exactly the same. They didn't call it digital skills, but they said we need more computer literacy. They didn't call it marketing and sales skills, but they said we need better customer service skills. They didn't call it we need kind of better agile management, but they said we need better project management skills. And so in some ways, as has been already pointed out, this has been an area of historical underinvestment. And my view is that, yes, we need to focus on what skills to build, but there are some no regrets things we can do for sure around problem solving skills in the workplace, around basic digital skills in the workplace, that absolutely everybody in, you know, the 35 million people, I think, who work in the UK could benefit from. So that's one thing. There are some not blanket, but like some no regret skills. The second thing is, I think it will need to be fairly local, and it will need to be employer driven, because the cycle, you can't, you know, predict and provide. And so from an educational perspective, maybe a lot of that will need to build those meta skills that are helpful no matter what. And then the kind of last bit of it, which is very job focused, will need to come from employers. And each employer will know for themselves precisely what those skills might be. And they might be quite firm specific around, you know, how do you optimize logistics in this company versus some other company? Or how do you, you know, best schedule customers in this particular beauty salon versus another? I think will be reliant on those kind of meta skills, and then employers taking the lead in actual training.
Excellent. Andrew, did you want to come in there? Did I see you wave your hand?
Yeah, just very briefly again, I'm not going to repeat what Tara said because I agree with a lot of that. I think interestingly, it means, you know, there is a conversation going on, but I think we will need to be much more focused on almost the middle part of the skills provision. So we often talk about the supply of the course or the skill, and then we often think about, well, what employers looking for. I think, you know, the information and the advice in between what we would call the matching function, where you're helping individuals make good choices, and actually you're informing firms as to what's on offer through the labour force. I think, you know, that is going to be a big area, and I would suggest, you know, if you talk to experts in the field, that's been a particular area that has seen significant underinvestment for the last decade or so, since the last time when we had, you know, New Deal and all the like of it in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s, you know, where we were active in the information, advice and guidance space. And I think there is something quite substantive and significant that localities can be doing to help bring these two aspects together. So it's not just only saying, what are the courses? We need more courses, as it were, but actually, how do you make sure that people are making the right choices and are aware of the courses and are then being matched into the jobs market as well? So that would be my kind of two penneth on that thought. Excellent.
So if I add very quickly, so I won't repeat points because I wrote down 3 and I think Tera took all 3 of them. But if I emphasize one point, which is that so for any of the skills challenges, there's a prerequisite, which is that people achieve kind of basic skill level numeracy, literacy, and digital skills that enable them to develop new skills on top of that. And often when you look at us compared to other countries, it's that level of skills where we really stand out. And as Tera mentioned, this is an education problem, but it's also a lifelong learning problem and an area where we currently underinvest. So yes, fix the other problems, but that's also an absolutely key one to being able to develop any of the skills as well.
Excellent. Well, we're almost out of time, but there's a couple of quick final questions that we'll take. So we've got 2 here. I'll ask them together and ask for all the panel to take them in short time. They are from Rachel Clay, who asks, what role does housing play in levelling up? I imagine that's a whole new discussion in and of itself, but if you could take a brief look at that as a question. It's a very important one, given the housing challenges that play out in different regions in different ways. And then also Paul Burns asks, does the panel agree that the infrastructure investment programme should be the main focus for job creation schemes? I think extending on some of the points we were just touching on, but you could take those last 2 ones quickly, and I think then we'll be out of time. But let's take those 2. Thank you.
So if I jump in very quickly on the housing one, let me say very quickly that housing costs are, well, when we look at it, one of the biggest driver of rising poverty rates where we see them in recent years. But let me use the opportunity to advertise a future report in the series and to say we will be having a deeper dive into the role that social housing should play in the stimulus that we need now. So it also has a key role in getting people access to job opportunities, and yes, it has a key role in levelling up that we haven't covered now but will be in the future. On infrastructure investment, I think there's 2 key points. I think a lot more can be done with infrastructure investment to create opportunities to skill people. And as Tera was talking about, opportunity to link job creation programs with solving some of our longer term challenges on skills. So yes, they're a good thing to do, but there's also, as Tera mentioned before, an important gender dimension here, that we shouldn't only be thinking about those sorts of jobs which tend to be more male oriented. And there's huge need to think of jobs that are going to be accessible to everyone that needs them.
So yeah, let me just, I bring them 2 together. I mean, I again agree, you know, housing in this country is too expensive, full stop. And that is a political choice, because we make housing too expensive by constraining the provision of housing across the country. And we can do something about that if we so wish. So we would have large effects just simply by building more housing, the direct effects on construction and the multipliers associated with that. That's an ideal kind of a way to think about it. You get, many bucks for your, or many bangs for your buck, as it were. But related to the other point, when we think about infrastructure investment, actually, we often think about new stuff and extra stuff, building new things. And actually, just to go back to housing, actually, big program of work around energy efficiency. And actually, when you look at the distribution of inefficient housing, that is part of the leveling up agenda. In terms of energy efficiency housing, you'd see lots of it in places that we would ideally want to be investing in more generally. So there's a kind of maintenance and upgrade question, which we ignore often in an infrastructure conversation, because it's all about the shiny and the new and the extra, rather than, where we can substantively improve the both. So you can bring two of those questions together and think through it from a housing lens, and I would be pretty confident that you would get the jobs effects that you would ideally want. You get energy efficiency effects that you would want, which are climate change orientated, and you would get a kind of leveling up agenda just because of the distribution of the problem.
So just, I agree with everything. The only thing I would say is that focusing on infrastructure is not enough. We absolutely also need to invest in the human capital, and that can be both in the short term stimulative, and of course it's an investment for the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to the panel today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much for joining us for this this lunchtime webinar, as it is now. It's the first in a series, as we were hearing today. The focus has been on productivity. It's an important, really, really important metric. Sounds a bit nerdy and techie sometimes, but it really is key to lifting living standards across the country and to help people break out of poverty where they are trapped in it. The past decade's been particularly tough for that. We've had the worst decade for productivity gains since the Industrial Revolution, a very slow recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. We find ourselves in another emergency now where we need to reshape and re-emerge stronger and lifting people out of poverty as we do so. As I mentioned, Joseph Rowntree are starting a series of economic discussions. Today was on productivity. In future, there'll be more on the labour market, something that we heard a lot about there. And as Dave just gave us a sneak preview, more on housing as well. So do come back to Joseph Rowntree to hear more from them. We'll certainly be in touch with you as well. But it's been a great pleasure to host this event. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you also to our panellists, Tera Allas from McKinsey, Andrew Carter from the Centre for Cities, and Dave Innes, of course, from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Thank you so much for your time today, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.